Hi, my name is Trevor Klee, and this is the MCAT CARS process. So, a little bit about the sort of idea behind this process a couple things. First of all, so the CARS section is different from every other section on the MCAT. So it's the only section that's entirely skill-based. There's no content on it, there's no facts. Now, this is probably really obvious, except for the fact that if it's different from every other section on the MCAT, why do people try to study for it like every other section on the MCAT? I don't know. They do that, they try to study for it. They try to do their flashcards or their, you know, or their notes or watch videos or whatever, and it just doesn't work. It's skill based. You're not going to memorize your way into doing well on CARS. So, how do you do well on CARS? Well, you have to focus on the skill, and specifically, you have to focus on a process for CARS. And if you focus on the process, and if you really work hard on getting better at the process, and you practice it, then you practice it some more. And when you get it wrong, you go back and check how to do it better through an error log. Then you'll actually get better on CARS, and that's how you end up getting those 130 plus scores in CARS that everyone wants. If you're looking to learn more and practice this process, by the way, you should probably check out my entire book that I've taken this passage that I'm going to be doing from, which is on my Gumroad page, which is gumroad.com/Trevor Klee. Check it out if you want a lot more process or practice on this process. Wow, that gets confusing. All right, so with that being said, let's practice our process. Let's learn about it. We'll learn about the skill you need to get better at CARS, and then put it to use on an actual passage. So the process is based on a really simple idea, and the really simple idea is you'll never be tested on the entirety of the passage. They'll never ask you to write an essay or defend it in a speech or, argue about it. You'll never be tested on it, and you don't need to understand it. You don't need to understand the entire passage, right? So if you're wasting a lot of time reading the passage, stop. Especially if you're like, oh, I'm a slow reader, I can never finish CARS. Well, then don't read so much. If you're like, I'm a bad reader, I can't really understand CARS. Well, then focus your efforts on just reading the parts of CARS that you need to read, right? Don't focus your efforts on trying to understand the whole passage. So this is really important, which is why I underlined it. You'll never be tested on the entirety of it. So with that being said, how do we make sure that we're, instead of trying to understand the whole passage, we're only understanding the parts of it? Well, that's what this process is about. It's about only understanding the parts of CARS that matter for the questions. So, step one, for each passage, we create a mental summary of each paragraph, and we do that by focusing on the first and last sentences of each paragraph. This is pretty straightforward. If you're a slow reader, I'd actually advise you to only read the first and last sentences of each paragraph. Otherwise, if you're a quick reader, I would just say focus on the first and last sentences of each paragraph. And as you go through these paragraphs, you should be creating a mental summary. This should be enough for a question like, what's the main theme? And it also should be enough to just give you an outline of the passage. Tell you, okay, which paragraph talks about which? What's the whole passage about? How does the idea develop? Because that's going to help you a lot when it comes to the questions, and you're like, okay, this question asked me about, education. Okay, which paragraph asked me about or was talking about education? Let me read that one. So if you're good at this will stop you from rereading and being like, I don't know where in the passage they talked about, happiness or whatever. Instead, you'll be like, okay, that was paragraph 3, done. So again, mental summary of each paragraph. Try not to write anything down. It takes a long time. Again, like our focus on cars is being quick, and writing things down takes time. So we're focusing first and last sentence of each paragraph. All right, step 2 in this process. So once we've created the summary of each paragraph, now we look at the questions. So we're going to look at the questions, we're going to interpret them. Sometimes our mental summary is going to be enough to just answer the whole question without reading anything else, in which case that's great. Sometimes it's not enough, in which case we'll have to go to the passage. And again, here we're going to be using the question itself to tell us what we need to read. So maybe they ask us something specific about happiness, and we're like, okay, I'm going to go to paragraph 3, which is where they talked about happiness, and I'm going to scan for the word happiness. So we're going to be focusing on keywords here to tell us which parts of the passage, and we're going to be scanning for those keywords to tell us what specific sentences. So our goal here is to look for the specific sentences. Now, once we get to the passage, any question is really going to have like 1 or 2 sentences. So your goal here after step 2 and step 3 is going to be, what are the 1 or 2 sentences that tell you exactly what you need to know, where you can really hone in on it and be like, oh, okay, that's what I needed to know. Now, if this is the sort of thing that's like, if the question says, why did the author say this, or why did the author bring up this, aka if we're looking for context, we're always going to look at the sentence before and after for context. So that's just sort of like a detail on this. So in step 2, right, we look for keywords. In step 3, we're looking at the passage. If in step 2, right, they were like, why did the author bring up happiness? In step 3, we're not only going to be looking for happiness, but once we find it, we read the sentence before and after to understand the context. Last, in step 4, we go to the answer choices. Now, by this time, we should have a really good idea of what we expect to see in the answer choices. So sometimes on the tougher questions, there'll be like no details in the question, and it'll just be like, which of the following is like mentioned in the passage or supported in the passage. And then we basically have to go use the answer choices to tell us what information we need to read in the passage. So we pretty much go skip to step 4, find the specific parts of the passage, and then go back here. Ideally, though, we're going to limit that as much as possible. So, going through and looking, using the answer choices to tell us which parts of the passage we need to read, pretty difficult, actually. Like, it's time consuming because like there's 4 things we're going to have to look at, rather than just like, 4 sentences we'll have to search for rather than just like 1. So here we need to use a lot of crossing out and say, well, I don't think that answer choice is great. And then, then we have our answer. So let's run through this again real quick. So we create a mental summary of each paragraph, focus on the first and last sentences, right? That was step 1. That should get us like our main idea or our theme, and it should give us an outline of the passage so we know what more to look at. Then we go to our questions. If our mental summary is enough to answer the question, great. If it's not, we'll use the question to tell us which additional details we need to read in the passage. So we'll look at our keywords and we'll scan for our keywords. In step 3, right, we're in the passage now. We're looking for the exact sentence or 2 that tells us what we need to know. If, on the other hand, it's asking for context, we look for the exact sentence, and then we also look for before and after. And then last up in step 4, by this point, we should know, here's the answer choice I want. and then we just pick the right answer choice. And we read carefully, so we're, making sure not to. I'll actually add this detail. Read carefully, because there's going to be a lot of trap answers, because they love their trap answers. If we need to, we'll use the answer choices to tell us the additional information we need to read in the passage. But instead of looking up every answer choice in the passage, we're going to try to cross out our answer choices as much as possible before we, go back and search for all 4 answer choices in the passage. All right, so that's pretty much it. This is the process. Now, again, if you're a bad reader or slow reader, this process should be really helpful for you, but it also should be really helpful for anyone. And one really important thing about this process is that it is improvable, right? So if you're trying to do cars just by I'm going to plow through a bunch of cars questions, it's really hard to fix it. If you get a question wrong, you're like, I don't know why I got that one wrong. But if you have this process, if you get a question wrong, it went wrong in one of these steps. So that's how you can fix this. It either went wrong when you created your mental summary of the passage, when you interpreted the question, when you interpreted the specific sentence of the passage, or when you interpreted the answer choices. It can only go wrong in one of those 4 steps, and that'll help a lot when you're fixing this. So this is really important that it's an improvable process. All right, cool. So that's what this, process is in general. Let's talk about in specific. So I've got a passage here. Now, this is actually a passage that I pulled from an old magazine called the Harvard Book Review, which I don't think is around anymore. So I've adapted this and asked some questions about it. I didn't pull passages directly from MCAT CARS, because if you do that, the AMC comes to your house and they steal your microwave. Also, they sue you and make you take it off of YouTube. So this is an original passage and questions that I've taken pretty much directly from the MCAT. So let's start with step 1. Step 1 of our process. All right, so first and last sentence. So Goethe admonishes the artist to create in forms of beauty, not to talk about beauty, and is certain that no man ever became a poet from the study of an art of poetry. There's no disputing about taste, de gustibus non disputandum. So Goethe said, create beauty, don't talk about beauty, which, you can't become a poet by studying the art of poetry. There's no disputing about taste. All right, that sort of makes sense. Create poetry, don't talk about it, especially because you can't argue about taste. Nevertheless, we know that taste can be cultivated, and that understanding not only makes the taste more discriminating, but also multiplies the source of aesthetic pleasure. Both, therefore, contribute to the further cultivation of taste. Ugh. So, even though you can't argue about taste, taste can be cultivated. So, and that understanding makes taste more discriminating and multiplies the source of aesthetic pleasure. So this makes sense. So taste can be cultivated. You're not going to change it, but you can make it better, and it's going to make your taste more discriminating. You're going to be able to better decide what you like. So, next paragraph. The practice of arts must be complemented by the commentary of theory in order to progress. Could it be a coincidence that concurrently we find in Italy many writers on aesthetics emancipating themselves from the constraint of ancient authoritative axioms? So now we're sort of going back to our initial thing where it's Goethe said, don't talk about poetry, make poetry. Here, we're talking about the practice of arts must be complemented by the commentary of theory in order to progress. So it's this whole idea of actually, if you're going to make it go further, you do have to have commentary in order to progress. And here we have some kind of historical example going on of that. So, which presumably is all about like cultivating tastes. Art is progressing because it's also complementing, because taste is being cultivated by theory. All right. And last paragraph, in the absence of theory, all of the fine arts are simply regarded as arts of imitation, left bereft of illumination. Unfortunately for them, which I guess is critics, they did not, which I guess was, they did not approach the sort of theory that eventually drove art forward. There is no such advancement until such critical questions were asked, and ancient dismissals of such questions disregarded. All right. So if we don't have theory, we just have imitation, right? Art is just imitation. And when critics didn't ask questions, right, there was no art driving forward. So if we look at this passage as a whole, we start off by saying, like, don't create in beauty, like, don't talk about beauty, just create, because you can't argue about taste, but taste can be cultivated, right? And so you have to actually complement art and theory together. We have an historical example, because if you don't have theory, art is just imitation. And when critics didn't ask, questions, there was no advancement of art. I think we have a basic understanding of this passage. Obviously, there's big parts of this that we didn't read and that we don't understand. But if the questions don't ask about them, it doesn't matter. So I'm really going to not read anything more unless the question makes me read it. So let's go to question 1 here. According to the passage, taste is, well, I know we can't argue about taste, right? That's where we talk about here. You can't argue about taste. There's no disputing about taste. You can cultivate it, but you can't argue about it. So according to the passage, taste is individual. Yeah, that seems pretty good, right? That's why you can't argue about it. Everyone has their own taste. Universal, no, that's the opposite. Inexplicable, well, he's arguing about it a lot, so no. Arguable, no. I think arguable, you might think like, oh, well, obviously we can argue about it. But I think arguable is more like, we're disputing about, we can't dispute about taste specifically. We can talk about it in general and cultivating it, but you can't tell someone their taste is wrong. So I think individual makes the most sense here, right? You can't argue about it. Everyone has their own taste. It's not universal. It's not inexplicable, right? Like, we try to explain it. We write our theory about it, but yeah. So individual works. So this one, we didn't actually need to read anything more, right? Suppose that writers in the 15th and 16th century had been content to follow tradition rather than to attempt to develop theories of their own. Information presented in the passage would predict which following. All right, let's see. So where do we talk about writers in the 15th and 16th century? Probably somewhere, yeah, this was where we had our historical thing, right? In this third paragraph here. So here, oh yeah, I see it. The revival of learning in the 15th and 16th century provide excellent examples of this, which excellent examples of what? That the practice of art must be complemented by the commentary of theory. So, if writers in the 15th and 16th century had been content to follow tradition, then, we'd get this idea that, practice of arts must be complemented by the commentary of theory in order to progress. So if there are no theories of their own, practice of arts would have stagnated. Yes. Taste would have never become cultivated. Never is such a strong word here. Like, obvious, like, maybe not at that time, but like, if they started developing theories of their own in the 17th century, then it would have become cultivated. So, I mean, I always am on the lookout for this strong words. And so that's incorrect. I can't say never. I would just say not at that time. 3, the Renaissance artist could have done no more than simply assimilate art. I don't really know what assimilate means in this context. Like, I know what assimilate means in general, but like I don't really know what assimilate means here. So I'm going to look for the word assimilate because I assume it's a technical term. So looking for my technical term, assimilate. Haha, found it. Sort of jumped out. This is my technical term, assimilate. So artists without theory assimilate the arts. So, yeah, I mean, that seems pretty accurate, right? Artists without theory assimilate the arts. Yep. Artists, Renaissance artists, right, which are these guys, 15th and 16th century. I sort of knew that already. If you didn't know that, it's right here, men of the Renaissance, right, 15th and 16th century, men of the Renaissance. It's literally just the sentence afterwards. Then I've got this technical term, assimilate, and yes, without theory, you assimilate the arts. Renaissance artists could have done no more than simply assimilate art. Yep, 1 and 3 only. Done. All right. What best represents the author's explanation as to why ancient critics were misguided when they claimed the end of art is to arouse emotion? I would bet that's in like the third paragraph, right? Because that's when we sort of talk about like ancient criticism, right? We talked about that at the end, like sort of the critics who didn't ask the important stuff. So let's look for that. The end of art is to arouse emotion. Found it. I found the term arouse emotion. Critics of that time. And so now let's find our context. So our context is going to be the sentence before and the sentence after. Sentence before, not super helpful. Sentence after is helpful. What they missed, though. So they being the critics, right? So this is our context. What they missed, though, was that pleasure is not just a personal reaction, but a learned reaction. Yeah, okay. So the end of art is to arouse emotion. Okay, so yeah, pleasure is not just personal, but learned. That makes sense, right? So here we've got our context, like why ancient critics were misguided. Well, they didn't realize that pleasure wasn't just personal, but also learned. So why they were misguided. In doing so, they oversimplified a complex issue. I don't know if it's really like oversimplifying it so much as missing something, right? So oversimplifying sounds like they're correct, but they're just like boiled it down too much. But it sounds like the author's like, no, they actually missed something. So I don't like A. B, correct in this idea. No, they weren't correct in this idea. They missed something. C, the end of art is not to arouse emotion, but to cultivate taste. No, so it's not like totally just to cultivate taste. It's this idea that like pleasure is not just a personal reaction, but a learned reaction. All right. D, the idea of arousing emotion ignores the possibility of appealing to more cultivated sensibilities. Yeah, that's like cultivated is the same idea of like learned, right? Cultivation of taste, learned taste. Yeah, so the idea of arousing emotion ignores this possibility. So there we go. And notice here, there's like huge amounts of this passage that I didn't read, right? That I literally have no idea what it says. I don't know what any of this stuff is. I don't know what most of this is. I don't know what most of this is, right? I didn't have to read all that. I only had to read very select parts of this, and I was able to answer every question here. And I did it way faster than someone who had to read the whole thing. So that's why this process is super helpful. I hope you found this entertaining or illuminating. If you want a whole book with a bunch of worked out passages, including this one, that explain this process further, check out my Gumroad page, gumroad.com/Trevor Klee. Has my book on there. Also, check out my tutoring page, which is trevorkleetutor.com. So yeah, check out my Gumroad page, check out my tutoring page. That's spelled poorly. Trevor, trevorkleetutor.com. Yeah, I hope you found this helpful. Please like, subscribe. Let me know if you have any questions. And I'll see you on the slopes. All right.